Hi, Liz. It's nice to have another West Coaster on the show today. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going good. Thanks so much for having me. I'm calling in from out of the Seattle area.
Yeah, it's great. I love Seattle. Bay Area is nice and sunny today. I just flew in earlier from Memphis where it was 80 degrees. I landed in Denver and it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit.
Ooh.
I'm like in the 60-degree Bay Area where this is what we have all the time. So, what's your weather like? Are you getting rain? Because that's
Right.
the cliche about Seattle.
It's currently sunny, but it is cold. Just in the last couple days, it's been kind of in the 40s, which is cold for us. I know it's not cold for everywhere.
Exactly. Well, we have some great friends up in the Seattle area that used to be a part of Mars Hill Church, of all things. And
Oh,
so we
yeah.
have similar adjacent experiences that we like to spend time with them and hang out. And actually, we knew them from when we were in Indonesia
Mm.
because they spent some time there. So we've been up to the Seattle area a few times to visit them. But it's nice to get to know you. And maybe next time I'm up there, we can have coffee together. Thanks for sending me your book.
Oh,
Everybody check out
absolutely.
this book. Yeah. Nice churchy patriarchy. I just love the title. And also, my first
Thank
question for
you.
you is did you ever think you would write a book called Nice Churchy Patriarchy?
No, for most of my life, definitely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it came out of a lot of experiences I found myself unpacking as I looked back on my 20s. But I definitely did not set out to write such a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love the way so much of your book is narrative. I find that the narrative method is something that really helps us change our minds. Obviously, you are a
Mm.
very intelligent, educated woman. You went to Stanford. And I love Dr. Beth Allison Barr's book. When I read it, I mean, her as a
Mm.
historian, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I remember the parts of it that I really appreciated was her vulnerability about her personal story, integrating that into history as well.
Mm.
So, when you started out wanting to write this book,
Mm.
were you always expecting to write more of a narrative method? Or how did that kind of evolve for you when you were starting to write?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, like you, I really believe in stories and their power to shape our world and our experiences. And especially for women in churches who are often made to feel alone in any frustrations they might have, I think it's really powerful to just hear from others, hear how people are processing things, hear about the experiences people have had. And I spent a lot of my time in seminary, assuming that I would probably apply to PhD programs afterwards. And I think that what I eventually realized by the end, and there are people in academia who are totally awesome exceptions to this, like Beth Allison Barr,
Right.
and who are able to write things that reach a broader audience. But I think sometimes in academia, people get kind of stuck in this kind of jargon and academic speak that isn't really understandable or interesting to a broader audience. So yeah, I do think that I wanted to focus on kind of my stories and bring in some of the academic stuff, but in a more personal way.
Well, it's very compelling, and I do hope everybody listening gets their hands on your book, Nice Churchy Patriarchy. If nothing else, the title is hopefully compelling enough to make people want to say, what is going on? But I do love that. I mean, Dr. Scott McKnight, he's been on the show 3 different times, and that's one of the things I appreciate
Mm.
about him is he's a world-renowned theologian or writer about the historical Jesus. He's like one of the, primary experts on that in terms of scholarship, has written, close to 100 books at this point, but he can write in a way that everybody can read it as well as doing the more
Yeah,
academic writing. And that's certainly a challenge. But I want to
yeah,
I want to get into this whole
yeah.
you use a lot of pseudonyms in the book, and I understand all the reasons why. Many of us, having had experiences like what you're describing in the book, do that kind of thing. There's a couple options, and that's the option you went with for a particular reason. But you did spend time here at Stanford in the Bay Area. You mentioned in the book how you grew up seeing
Yeah.
women pastors, even a grandma, and you were at PCUSA, but you have this guy, Dave. So we're going to talk about Dave. He's not a villain. He's at Faith Bible Church here in the Bay
Mhm.
Area, which is your pseudonym for
Mm.
him and the
Mm.
church. Um, and he says this thing, and I want you to explain this story to us. He says, giving people what they want
Mm.
isn't always what's best for them. Tell us what that was all about.
Yeah, that was the first time that I recall ever feeling that there was something wrong in terms of how gender was thought about and operated at the church that I was going to in the Bay Area. I started going there at the beginning of my freshman year of college and stayed there for about 11 years total. And if I remember right, I think this was sometime during my sophomore year of college. We had a college group church Bible study kind of deal, and we would talk about different questions that Christians tend to wrestle with. And one evening, the topic was women in ministry. And that was something that people at my church had different opinions about. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have those conversations. But for me, as a college student, having not grown up in a church where there were any questions about women in ministry or women in leadership, it was pretty jarring. And
Yeah.
yeah, this comment that this person I called Dave made was especially jarring. Giving people what they want isn't necessarily what's best for them. I think somebody had said something like, well, if women want to preach and lead and teach, and if they feel like they're gifted and called for those things, why not let them? And so that was his response to that. And I think that I didn't quite have words at the time for how that made me feel and why I had such a strong gut reaction to it. But looking
Mm.
back, I would say it was infantilizing, it was patronizing. It operates out of this worldview where men are the ones in power and they can give things or not to women as they see fit. Yeah, so I think it's important for women to understand and own that we define what's best for us. We know what's best for us. We don't need to look to somebody else or to a man to tell us that. Yeah.
Yeah. I could only imagine what that experience was like for you as a college student. There's something very particular about that part of human development in your early 20s where you're trying to figure things out and you're, leaving the nest, so to speak, and figuring out what the world is like. And then having
Yeah.
something so jarring face you as a woman, as a Christian, must have been really bewildering for you. Do you remember at all how you felt? Or if you could go back, what would you say to yourself if you'd meet yourself at that age?
Yeah. Oh, there are so many things I would go back and say. I mean, I wish that I could go back and engage in that conversation because I wasn't really able to at the time. I think I was just so shocked and did not have any words for it. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think I would go back and affirm that shocked, just totally caught off guard feeling was totally reasonable. And I was actually um, talking with a couple other people who were in that room recently who really affirmed that and who remembered that conversation. And so I think I didn't realize at the time that I wasn't the only one who was kind of like, what is
Mm.
happening? So yeah, I think just kind of affirming I wasn't alone, I wasn't overreacting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Situations like that can just cause us sometimes to just freeze because it's so out of the ordinary, and it could be a
Mhm.
little bit of a fight, flight, freeze response of trauma just because you're
Yeah.
not sure. I mean, it really is an attack on your gender and your faith at the same time.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's a lot to process as such a young person. As you were writing this book, though, you had to
Yeah.
kind of dig into a lot of that, and both your experience
Yeah.
at Stanford, your experience in an evangelical seminary, your experience in churches and different things. So, what would you say is the hardest part about you writing Nice Churchy Patriarchy?
Yeah, it was a lot to dig into, but I think that process was really good. I think it was kind of empowering to be able to go back and share and reflect on these stories in light of everything I've learned since then. And in light of all the different feminist thinkers and writers and feminist faith writers that I've read and people I've talked with. And so I think it was kind of a healing thing to be able to write about it, to be able to tell my side of the story in a world that often centers male narratives, narratives of people in power, which in some of these contexts were, the same as male narratives. Um, so yeah, I think some of the hard things I think have been, I mean, I include nice in the title because that's the kind of environments I've been a part of. Like, people are really nice. And I mean that in kind of a snarky way, but also a really genuine way. Like, there's a lot of really kind, caring, generous, sincere people who are stuck in these religious environments that aren't serving women well or serving anyone well, really. And so, yeah, I think that in writing some of these stories, part of me was kind of like, am I being too hard on these nice people who were well intentioned and doing the best they could? And I think it's been hard to wrestle with that. And I mean, that's part of why I use pseudonyms too. And I'm really not trying to identify anyone at all, because it's not about the particular people. It's not about them being bad people. It's about the theologies and practices and mindsets that are damaging.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so important to understand that. I mean, there's that, this version of a quote has been said by many people, but when good people do nothing, that's when evil thrives, right? And so um, I think
Yeah.
that there are some people who've done some really horrible things, criminal acts, right? I mean, one of the things that's going on right now is the the Southern Baptist Convention, and there's like the state convention of Kentucky. I don't know if you've seen some of this stuff, and it's kind of blowing up recently. And there's
Mm.
survivors of abuse, really horrible abuse at the hands of pastors, father pastors, people who've done really criminal acts to both their own children and to congregants. And then for the Kentucky Baptists to come out and do this. Kind of act that they've done. And then the Southern Baptist Executive Committee coming out with a statement. And really, it's the doing nothing. It's the, oh, we're on the side of the press, we're on the side of
Mm.
the abused, we're doing this, we're in solidarity, and literally just being sort of nice about it, and sometimes not even nice. But I think that's where the evil is
Yeah.
thriving. So when you don't name people in the book, it does allow us to imagine all of ourselves there. At some point, neutrality
Yeah.
isn't an option, right? There's famous quotes like Bonhoeffer about
Yeah.
what was going on in Europe at the time too. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on that when there's just good people really doing nothing and just being nice, and how that has affected women in the church?
Mm. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that in the church that I went to for 11 years in the Bay Area, that was kind of the most, it's called in the Christian world, complementarian or kind of explicitly patriarchal environment that I've been a part of. And I think that how that played out there was that people in the church, people of all genders in the church, had all sorts of different views when it came to gender and leadership and marriage and everything. But because the church was set up in such a patriarchal way, it was really hard to change anything. And it kind of made it seem like people who tried to raise any questions or concerns were causing trouble. And I think there's kind of a downplaying there of the trouble that was already being caused and the pain and yeah, unnecessary difficulties and woundedness that was being caused by the way things already were. Yeah.
Yeah. It when the system is working for the people that are in power, it does feel like a threat for those who speak up and say, well, this isn't working for
Right.
us. Sort of like when I was in
Right.
Memphis, I went to see, that National Civil Rights Museum. It's so impactful. I'm still not over it. It's built around the hotel where Dr. King
Mm.
was assassinated. And it starts with, enslaved people being brought over on these ships and forced labor camps
Mm.
to work, and it's all for cotton and tobacco, and like the greed was, it's like
Yeah.
supposedly great for the people that are profiting, but for the enslaved people starting to revolt and saying this isn't right, and then you have a long history of one amendment after another that has and then rights and then Jim Crow and all, and and it's still going, right? And so it's working for the people in power, and so it's like, wait, why are you so angry? Why are you trying to change it? Well, because it's not
Right.
working for us. So did you feel that way as a woman,
Right.
and at what point did you start to realize that about yourself in the church?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think that before I had kind of the words or the frameworks or the courage to speak up about these things myself, I saw other people doing it. And there's one woman I think of who went to that church who was much more outspoken than I was about kind of trying to push for gender equality. And I saw how she got labeled by the male leaders at the church as kind of coming with her own agenda, and being divisive and, yeah, kind of trying to stir things up. So, yeah, I saw that play out. I think that people really are written off as being overly demanding or self-serving just by trying to advocate for their own rights or the rights of others. And yeah, I think that a lot of voices that try to push for change are squashed, silenced, marginalized. And that's why it's so important that those of us who feel like we're able to speak out about these experiences do.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you follow much of what's on in Iceland, but I had read about them years ago, knowing that the women of Iceland, historically have really stood up for themselves, and there's a lot more equality for women
Mm.
in Iceland than other places. And yet, uh, this this week they, had a day of striking, all the way up to the top seat of the government,
Mm.
women that were saying, we're just not going to work for today. So all that means that the unpaid labor at home and
Yeah.
everything we do. And some people have, come out and said, well, you have more equality here than anywhere else. Why are you doing this? And it's like, well, even if
Mm.
when there's not equal pay for equal work, just take that as an example. Even if it's a 20% pay
Yeah.
gap, it still is wrong. Like, we still deserve equal pay. So
Right.
there's still work to do. It's not, but sometimes, women might get treated as, you're so demanding, you have it better than everybody else. Why are you complaining? But it's like, well, until there's full equality, in the US, we don't even have the
Mm.
Equal Rights Amendment passed. It's been 100 years and 50 years of a long fight
Right.
in particular. So, yeah, what would you say to
Yeah.
someone who says, you're just being so picky, you're being such a diva, like, why are you complaining? You have it better than other women do.
Yeah, the comparison thing. Yeah. I mean, I definitely heard that in the church that I went to. That was complementarian. We called ourselves soft complementarian as opposed to
Yeah.
those hard complementarian churches that have even more restrictions around women in leadership. And I did feel like that was a way of saying, like, yeah, you don't have it that bad.
Mhm.
So I think it took me a while to realize that, as you said, any sort of inequality is not okay. Yeah, the point is not to see if we have it better than someone else, but I mean to dream of the world that could be, right? And to work
Mhm.
toward the world that could be, to work toward equality and justice for women and for everyone. So yeah, I'd say we need to keep our eyes on that vision of what we want to see.
Absolutely. Yeah. To have a prophetic imagination of what God intended in Genesis 1:27 when he made both man and woman in God's own image. Therefore, we both
Yeah.
bear God's image
Yeah.
equally. And before the fall, that's what was ideal. And if we're not trying to imagine a
Yeah.
world where that's here again, if we're not trying to imagine that kind of heaven on earth, something's wrong, something's off.
Mm.
I also would love for you to
Yeah.
answer this because the Barbie movie's been pretty big this year. There's been a lot of
Yeah.
talk about that movie, and I know a lot of people have written Substack newsletters. A lot of writers sort of reacted to the Barbie movie, and especially America Ferrera's character's speech that was so impactful. I mean, I was
Yeah.
sitting in the theater when I heard it. There were these little girls playing Barbies around me, and my whole family was standing there. Um, and it got really quiet when she gave her speech. Like, you could have heard a pin drop. Even the little girls who had been kind of not paying attention stopped and were silent. It was an incredible moment in the
Hmm.
theater. But I'd love to hear how it resonated with you and what you think it means for us in the church.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm so glad that the Barbie movie happened and that so many people saw it. I feel like we need to be talking about patriarchy and talking about it directly. Otherwise, I don't know how anything's going to change. Um, and yeah, America Ferrera's speech was powerful and kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of what a lot of women experience in this conflicting web of expectations that's impossible to fulfill. I think for me, I found myself a little bit dissatisfied with where we ended up at the end of the movie in terms of a reversal of power dynamics as opposed to figuring out how we actually share power and create an equitable world together. So I had some mixed feelings about it, but I do think that that speech was very powerful. I think it's complicated, right? Like the Barbies got deprogrammed so easily just from hearing that speech, and I wish that it was that easy in real life.
Mm,
I think it can take a lot more working through things over a long period of time. But that vision of kind of being deprogrammed from feeling the need to fit into all those impossible expectations, that's a good thing.
yeah, it is a good thing. I think that when we center women and their narratives, like you've done in your book, we can suddenly start to see a different perspective. And that's true of any
Mhm.
marginalized group, anyone who's feeling,
Yeah.
who is experiencing any form of oppression, abuse of power, or that kind of thing. But just if you're
Yeah.
not the status quo, if you're not the default, we're so used to listening to particular voices. And so suddenly, when we hear a speech from someone like that in a movie, and it's not something we've really heard in that way, in that kind of environment before, it can be a light bulb for some of us. Um, was there any
Yeah. Yeah.
particular part of the speech that resonated with you?
Hmm. I think just that it's literally impossible to be a woman. I feel like I've thought about this
Yeah.
quite a bit. 'Cause I mean, I don't it's not like it's impossible to be a woman, it's like it's impossible to be a woman in a way that meets everybody's expectations of you, in a way that isn't criticized or mocked or belittled. So I think just that idea of like women feeling and being empowered to be our whole selves and be whoever we actually are and not what a patriarchal world tells us that we should be. I mean, I think that just that general idea is very powerful.
Yeah. And I think for the men who were able to sit through that, my husband was there and my boys as well. And we debriefed it a little bit. And it was like, I remember feeling as a woman, like, it's not that they've never seen movies where women are the main characters, or there was just something so off the charts about this particular movie with the woman directing it, and it was all created. I mean, the whole process of the movie was just really different. The
Yeah.
way it just blew the top off the box office, and all that too, right? But and that it was
Right.
having this deep
Totally.
conversation. There was something about all of it, the whole package.
Yeah.
But so many men having the world work for them, you know, having, the
Right.
wind at their back, all things being equal, a woman
Right.
and a man coming out of Stanford, same degree. It's the wind is going to be at the back for a man, no matter how hard you've worked, no matter
Yeah.
how many times you made the honor roll and all the things you did to get there. That there's something I think sometimes um, the male experience would not understand really how hard it is, how much pressure is on us, how impossible it is. So yeah, we do have many men that listen to this podcast. What would you say to them based on your experience in this whole thing?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think just what you said about listening to and centering women's stories and taking them seriously, believing women's stories by default, I think all that's really powerful and really world changing. And I do think that, yeah, when you're on the upper side of any of those power structures, and I experienced this as a white person in the US context for sure, like it's hard to see a different point of view. And I think it takes a long time and a lot of intentional effort to try to sit at the feet of thinkers of color, of women of color, especially, and just try to learn, try to understand a different perspective. And I think that people who are on the underside of different power structures see things that others don't see and things that are real and true and there. So I think if we're trying to get a fuller picture of reality, if we're interested in seeing beyond our own perspectives, if we're interested in answering questions like, why aren't there more women in places of power? Yeah, we've got to listen to women's experiences and not make assumptions about some of the reasons for that. I mean, when I was in the Bay Area working in tech, before I went into Christian ministry, things like that would come up, right? Like, how come there aren't more women in programming? Oh, well, it's because they're not interested in it. And I was like, I feel like just as a woman in like a tech adjacent field, like it's very obvious to me that there are just so many barriers for anyone who wants to be there. So yeah, listening to women's stories, taking them seriously, not making assumptions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. I talk about this in my workplace currently, and I'm glad to be in an environment where that's a more open conversation than when I worked in church or evangelical spaces in general,
Mhm.
I guess. But I don't know if you follow much
Yeah.
of the work of in McKinsey. They do research every year, and their State of the Women in the Workplace just came out a couple weeks ago, and I'm always paying attention to that. And every year, I think for the last 9 years, it's basically said pretty much the same thing in a particular area, which is that um, the real problem with women in the workforce in the United States is the bottom rung is a place women tend to not get up to. So it's like individual contributor to manager, like that first step is so much more likely to be a man. That
Mm.
there is something about our default when we think leader, who's going to go from individual contributor to that first manager leader position, it's going to in our brains almost always be a man, and we'll almost always see women as not capable, even though they have incredible leadership skills, and many of them are running the whole
Right.
project at home. They're project managers of their own homes, and have to always make
Right.
sure that the catering is happening at their house, whether it's them cooking or not, and that it's getting clean,
Right.
and all the amount of skills that they have and still not noticed. So McKinsey has been pointing this out right
Yeah.
every year for 9 years. So I'm sure you face that in the tech world. It's a conversation I've had recently, even with the position I get to have in a tech space and leadership and development. So what would you say to
Mm.
people listening right now that are suddenly having a light bulb go on, whether they're in a nonprofit, a church space, or tech or anything, about what they could do to help women even get to that first, rung?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question, but I like it. I think there's your question makes me think of the book Mediocre by Ijoma
Mm,
Oluo. And she really gets into like what does leadership look like and what are the qualities that we look for or admire or respect in a leader and how those qualities, which are often coded as masculine, do not actually make for the best and most effective leaders, right? Like we need leaders who are collaborative, who listen, who want to work together, who don't want to just take the credit for themselves, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that women are always like that, but in some
right.
ways, women are socialized to be some of those things. So yeah, kind of re-examining what a leader looks like, both in terms of their gender and in terms of style. Not necessarily looking for the most out there, like take charge kind of person who isn't going to listen to anyone else's opinions, because that's not actually best for a team or for a company. Um, and I think,
Yeah.
like when I was working in the church world, I definitely felt these things. I think that the way that people seek after promotion or just different opportunities is seen really differently based on gender. And I think that
Yeah.
women are often hesitant to put themselves out there and advocate for themselves and their ability as a leader. And I think that's not just a lack of self confidence, it's also the way that people often react to women when we do those things. So I think, yeah, I'd say, think twice about your reactions to women who seem ambitious or assertive. And yeah, I think we can consider like what behaviors are women showing that we might consider in a positive way if we saw them in a man, but we feel like they come across negatively in a woman. So I think it's a matter of re-examining all sorts of assumptions about who belongs where and what a good leader is and what it looks like to have ambition and to want to be in that kind of role.
Yeah, I've read quite a bit about. We've probably read some of the same books, but there's a lot about the likability factor that women have, and that's not just in evangelical spaces. That's
Yes.
kind of the ocean we all swim in, right? So this threading the needle that women are
Yeah.
expected to do in this culture, where we're both sitting right now, where if
Yeah.
there's if you're too ambitious, then you're seen as not hireable for a role or not promotable. And then if you're seen as
Sure.
too relational, you're not enough of a leader. And so that whole threading that needle is literally impossible. So that whole speech, America
Right.
Ferrera is she's
Right.
referencing that it's literally impossible to thread that particular part. And there's a million other reasons. But there's women listening right now who are still in evangelical churches. And so they're dealing with that extra layer that we're talking about now, and they realize something's wrong,
Yeah.
but they don't really know what to do. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends so much. Different churches are different. But I mean, if I was to speak to kind of myself in the time that I spent in an evangelical church, I would say, even though it's hard, try to have those conversations about what you're experiencing. Embrace your agency as a human who can push for change, who can try to make a difference, who can point out the things that aren't working and try to make things better. And I think, realistically, that is not always or even often well received. And I think that having those conversations involves also being willing to leave that environment
Yeah.
if necessary. And I think that that's really hard. There's so much that comes with that. There's so many fears surrounding that. But I do think, at least in my case, I think I was better off for not staying in that environment, even though it was hard. It was I wouldn't say my entire social world, but like so much of my day to day social world and professional world for a while. That there certainly was a cost to leaving, but it's been worth it in terms of being able to find spaces and relationships where I can be me, where my gifts are welcome and not looked at with a suspicious side eye, as I say in the book. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that has been worth it. And I've been surprised by some of the friendships that I've been able to keep, even though we might be in different places. And I think I had a lot of fear of losing relationships, but I think that the people who genuinely care about us will do their best to stick with us through the journey. And they'll want us to be honest, they'll want us to be in spaces that are good for us.
Yeah. I um my experience has been so similar. And I think a lot of us get,
Mhm.
and I use the word addicted sometimes, to that community. And it's because there are things that bond us together:
Mm,
shared lived experience, memories, our kids are friends with each other, all the things, there's in a lot of these church
yeah,
environments, you're with each other weekly, but often more than that. And so it is a lot to ask any human to give up one of the
yeah,
deepest needs we have, which is for connection with others and for community. And
right.
sometimes these communities they exploit that in some ways, in the nefarious part of it. It's not always that way, but in some cases it is somewhat. But it does keep a loyalty there. And so people start to overlook things, and betrayal blindness is real. And um, the
Mm,
status quo is so comfortable, even if it feels wrong and something feels not right. But in some
yeah.
cases, it does get a little bit worse than that. And so, what would you say to a woman who maybe they've tried to use their voice to advocate for equality, and they've been either silenced or disciplined or marginalized in some way for doing so?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, that is not okay that people responded in that way. And B, there are communities that are not like that. And I think sometimes we might feel like if we leave a particular church, we're walking away from God or from faith, if that's something that's important to us. And it's not like that, right? God is there with us in church and in what we might think of as a wilderness space, or a space of deconstructing and reconstructing, and a space of change. So yeah, I think I want to give the encouragement that there are faith communities. Sometimes they might be hard to find depending on where we live, but there are faith communities that do take women seriously, that honor and value women, or at least that want to, and so are willing to have those conversations and can do that better. There's communities that can receive what women have to offer, and I think it's worth finding those.
Mm, yeah. As you look back now and you sort of reflect on your experience as this young woman in your 20s in an evangelical church that didn't support women in leadership, What are some of your takeaways? What have you learned from that experience? And what can you offer people in terms of the transformation that you've gone through?
Takeaways, yeah. I mean, I think writing the book was just such a good process for me in terms of kind of categorizing some of these experiences and putting new language to them. So I think maybe one of the takeaways is that it's worth reflecting on experiences that have been difficult because we're women, or for any other reason, any other identity that's marginalized. It's worth reflecting on these things, it's worth processing them. And I think that in the church that I was in, it was so easy to write things off because, like we were talking about earlier, I knew that women had it worse other places. I knew it wasn't a bad place in all ways, right? Like it was a good community in some ways. Um, so um, I think not being afraid to go on the journey of taking seriously the things that we notice are not right. I think that's a good thing. I think that's one of the takeaways. And I would also say that, I mean, I think in the second half of the book, I get more into some of the things that I learned in seminary and things that I've thought about as
Yeah.
I've read different female writers. And it was really eye-opening in terms of even just within the Christian tradition, which is often expressed in very patriarchal ways, there are all sorts of resources, historical and present, that I found really empowering as a woman. So I think one of the takeaways is to maybe just not assume that the expression of religion that we're in currently is the only one out there, um, but to feel free to explore resources from different sorts of thinkers and really think through what resonates with us, what makes sense to us, what feels empowering and right.
Yeah, that's good. Um, we could potentially have some. I mean, I do have different male pastors or male, um, leaders in the church. Some in evangelical spaces, some just in the Protestant world or the Catholic world in general. Some Orthodox. There's a large expression. There's a large ocean of Christianity out there, right? With various
Yes.
expressions of it,
Yes.
and so many. Yeah, it's people often will be like, the Bible is clear. And it's like, really? Because I'm not sure even in English, we've agreed very much on the clarity of certain things. But anyway, the
Right.
good news is, people that
Yeah.
we have a lot of diversity that listen to this podcast of many religions, and then some who have, consider themselves atheist or agnostic, have no religion at all. Maybe were raised with one and don't now or never really had one. And all of that is welcome here in this podcast. But as you think about, some of our male pastors that might be listening or male church leaders, what is one thing you would ask them to do, to consider as a next step in terms of this conversation?
Ooh, just one thing.
Okay, three things.
um,
Three things is fine.
hmm.
Yeah. 10 things.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I would love it if more male pastors made an intentional effort to ask women in their congregation how they experience that congregation as a woman. I think,
Mm,
especially for those of us who have some things that are on our minds, but we aren't sure how to bring up, like just being initiated with or knowing that that feedback is welcome and wanted, I think can go a really long way. I would also say for pastors, I think a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, male pastors read scripture in a very male dominated way and preach in a very male dominated way. So I think I'd ask male pastors to consider, like, who are we focusing time on in our sermons? Are we seeing the women in scripture, the passages that we're reading? Are we seeing them as fully human? Are we reading maybe feminist or just female writers' commentary on those characters? And yeah, just kind of how are women coming across in our sermons and our Bible studies and other resources we might have to offer?
yeah, great advice. Well, this has been a really impactful conversation today. Is there anything you would like to say here as we close this podcast to anybody listening that's sort of something you're really passionate about or that's really compelling? What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. I just want people to feel so much freedom to pursue God and faith and spirituality in any ways that make sense to them and resonate with them. And to explore different expressions of faith, explore different kinds of faith communities. And again, I want women or other people who have been marginalized in religious contexts to know that they're not alone in that, um, to know that they're not being unfaithful to God or to the faith tradition if they have some questions or some things they wish were different or some things they push for change about. Um, yeah, so I think I just want to encourage people to consider that vision of the world that we want to see, to not settle for anything less, to expect pushback for sure, and keep going. Don't take that as a sign that we're not doing the right thing, and to find others who are on a similar journey because there are a ton of us. Yeah.
So good. Yeah, very well said. Um, yeah, as I mentioned, I was in Memphis this week and went to the National Civil Rights Museum, and one of the shirts in the bookstore or the little like gift shop at the end was that whole quote of nice, well-behaved women rarely make history, right? It's a good thing to keep in mind.
Amen.
We have a long history of
Yeah.
faith. Yeah, we have a long history of faith. We would not have the right to vote in the United States without many women of faith
Yeah.
who led that very strongly. Not exclusively
Yeah.
women of faith, but definitely it was the faith of women that compelled them in some cases to want to,
Yeah.
see that women had the right to speak in our government
Yeah.
and many things. They were often involved in the temperance movement. They were involved in so many things, abolition, many of them, although that's a
Yeah.
complicated history as well when it comes to white women and
Right.
women of Chinese descent
Yeah.
and Black women in the U.S. But hopefully, this is something men and women of all races could come closer and come around the table together with our differences, listening to one another, respecting each other. So I thank you for this book. Once again,
Yeah.
everybody, pick up Liz's book, Nice Churchy Patriarchy. And how can people find you and your writing and find out more what you're putting out there?
Yeah, I have a website at lizcooledgejenkins.com that has some info about the book and other writings. The book is available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, and bookshop.org. And I post pretty regularly on Instagram, and I love connecting with people there. So that's at Liz Cooledge.
Perfect. Liz, thank you so much for being on today. Thank you for writing this book, for putting your heart and soul into it. I know it's hard work, but we really appreciate your voice. And yeah, keep writing, keep speaking. We need
Thank you.
you in the conversation. Thanks for being on today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.